Hello, and welcome back to AP Environmental Science. Today, I want to talk about demographic transition, which really describes the process that countries go through during development. And you can divide the phases, or you can divide demographic transition into 4 phases. Basically, we're looking at the relationship between birth rate and death rate and how those affect the population, because as we already know, the size of the population is going to dictate a lot of the factors for quality of life, which is what we're exploring now. Phase 1 is where you have a very high birth rate, but you also have a very high death rate. I would like to say that at this point, there's no country in the world that is in phase 1. And so phase 1 is just not something we see anymore. But historically, we actually were in phase 1. We had high birth rates and we had very high death rates because we were at the mercy of our environment. We were at the mercy of the amount of resources that we could gather. And so this is kind of what we call primitive stability. So you have zero population growth or very small growth, but you basically have a balance. Now, when you move into phase 2, what you see is what we were talking about in the last set of notes for the human population. When I talked about falling death rates, I was talking about phase 2 of demographic transition, and this is where you get that growing population, which is why I talked about it in the last set of notes. But ultimately, phase 2 is marked by something changing that allows for more babies to survive, and more babies survive. Therefore, you have a growing population. There are some countries who are still fully in phase 2, but not really. Most countries are starting to move out of this, right? So here's your first mini quiz question. Countries in this region tend to be further along the demographic transition than the others listed. Latin America, East Asia, Western Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or all of these are about the same. They're actually not all about equal. Sub-Saharan Africa, when you're talking about countries that are in phase 2, those are actually going to be in Sub-Saharan Africa. But even in Sub-Saharan Africa, many of the countries are late stage 2 or really early stage 3. East Asia, same thing. Western Asia, same thing. Latin America, though, most of the countries in Latin America are actually fully in phase 3. They are on their way to industrialization. And so what you can see on a graph is that you could have a high birth rate, right? And then you have a high death rate. The death rate starts falling, so these guys are in phase 2, right? The death rate continues to fall. And then you have a stabilization of the death rate. And the idea is that you want to close this gap well before you have a population that really exceeds the infrastructure that can handle it. So phase 3 is marked by those falling birth rates, right? So, and by the way, this is sometimes called the fertility transition. This is sometimes called the epidemiological transition, because here you're really controlling disease, you're controlling premature deaths, things like that. Over here, you're actually bringing down the birth rate, and so that's why that's listed that way. Okay, so what causes birth rates to fall? So we know what causes death rates to fall because we talked about that last time, right? That was phase 2. So pretty much everything we talked about in the last notes were about phase 2. So falling birth rates, well, more children survive. Once you're sure that your children aren't going to die, then you are more likely as a society to start having fewer children. If you know that 70% of your kids are not going to make it, right, then you're more likely to have more children, so you have some survivors. So survival of children is a really big deal. Once you can show people that children are surviving, then they will start to have fewer children. The empowerment of women turns out to be really important. In lots of places around the world, women do not have control over the number of children that they have, right? And so the first thing that we do is elevate the status of women. And I love this picture because this is a female professor, and she is surrounded by male students in a environment that is typically not valuing women. And so we raise the value of women, and then women start to have become equally as welcome as men. So if you have a girl child, she is as equally valuable as a boy child. And that is really, really important. And once that starts happening, then women are able to have control of their reproductive rights, the number of children they have. And we're going to talk about this more in class. So if you have questions, we're going to talk about this more. You also need to be able to understand, one, how babies are born, and how to space them out so that you can have the number that you want to have and have enough time in between them so that the woman is not constantly just having children. And then, of course, education, right? In order to be valuable, you have to have an education. And at the very least, that means being able to read. Now, once you get an education, that's great. But if you can't do anything with it, then that doesn't really help the value of you in your society. And so job opportunities for women are really, really important. So all of these things, and the research shows some people want huge families, and that's wonderful. But most women don't actually want 6, 7, 8 kids. They want a number that they can support. And that number is different for different people. But ultimately, if you give the mother the choice, she wants only as many children as she can support, take care of, and make sure that they have a good quality of life. Send them to school, have good food, have clothes, right? Okay. The other thing that's important, actually, is the cost of raising children. This is the least important out of this list of 3, but it is a factor. If it's very, very expensive to have children and to educate children, then people might be less likely to have more children. This is not me saying all schools should be really expensive. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that people do take that into account. And in China, for instance, they no longer have a one-child policy, but they do have tax incentives to not have children. Or not have lots of children. Sorry, not have lots of children. Let me rephrase that. Okay, so when we have women who are able to have access to education, we see that total fertility rates go down, and it's really for 2 reasons. 1, women start focusing on other things than just having children, and 2, they end up delaying childbirth. And so delaying childbirth actually limits physically the number of children that you can have. And so simply by delaying the time the woman is going to give birth to a child, delaying marriage, things like that, that's going to actually limit the number of kids that you have. And by getting an education, you spend more time focusing on that. And so just graduating from high school, for instance, at 18, and waiting to have children until after that, as opposed to having children when you're 14, 15, or 16, you can have fewer children. I am not advocating for having children at 14, 15, 16, or 18 at all. I'm just saying, math-wise, that's how it works. Okay, so the other thing that also brings fertility rates down, interestingly enough, is income. And remember I said that most women don't want to have more children than they can support, but just because they have more money doesn't necessarily mean they want more children, right? And so we see the trends are that fertility rate drops with income. Okay, so and part of that is because people are working. If you have an income, you are working, right? And women who are working typically will have fewer children. All right, so which single factor is most important for a nation's fertility rate? The adult literacy rate, so education, the gross family income, so about having jobs, the percent of the population using contraception, access to the internet, which gives you information, or the percentage of the population practicing religion, which often gives guidelines about childbirth. Well, it's actually the obvious one in this case. And by the way, not everything you read on the internet is true. The percentage of the population using contraception actually is the single most important factor for a nation's fertility rate. I would like to say at this point, I am not making any sort of statement about whether people should or should not use contraception. That is up to families and individuals to decide. But it is a fact driven by data that if you have a higher percentage of women using contraceptives, fewer babies will be born. Okay. All right, in many developing countries, fertility rates are stabilizing after years of decline. So that's an interesting thing too, right? So what happens to cause fertility rates to sort of stagnate as they are dropping? Because if you look at these numbers, they're still exceedingly high, and total fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa average between 4 and 5, right? And that is a lot. And there are some countries that will go as high as 7. So this is an interesting conversation that we're going to have in class. Now, on the flip side, right, in Europe, we actually see that women are starting to have more children than they used to. And this is an interesting conversation. So we actually have a split in the world, and this seems to have something to, has to do with development, right? So if you're in phase 3, probably your total fertility rates are still coming down, right? Well, no, sorry. If you're in phase 3, your birth rates are coming down. Your total fertility rates are coming down. But by stage 4, they're already down, and so they're lower. And so you might run into the flip side where what if people are not having enough babies? And we're going to get to that in just a second. So the difference between phase 3 and phase 4, which we're about to talk about in a second, is really interesting. And so what we're really saying is the average total fertility rate in developing countries is what number there in developed countries? Is it a tenth of developed countries, half, equal to, or twice that in developed countries? Well, it turns out that the average total fertility rate is twice in developing countries what it is in developed countries. So remember I said that in sub-Saharan Africa it's like 4 or 5, right? In India it's 3, 4. In Europe, sometimes it's less than 2. In the United States, it's 1.8, 1.9, right? And so you've got that big growth. This is what's contributing to that huge growth in developing nations that we talked about last time. Okay, so let's switch into the phase 4 conversation. This is a really short conversation. At this point, you have the birth rates are down. They should be even with the death rates, right? And so you have a 0 population growth. You have a stabilized population. You have a rise in affluence, which we're going to talk about in just a second. Okay, so all of those things are happening. By the way, in phase 3 and phase 4, this is where industrialization happens. As the birth rate falls, once it falls fairly significantly, there is an excess of money, right? Because fewer children are having to go to school, so we're not having to support that infrastructure. Parents are probably having more disposable income, things like that. And so people can start putting money into other places, and you start to see a boost in the economy as you hit late stage 3, and then moving into stage 4, you should have a robust economy by that time. And we saw this in Asian countries as they came into and are now in late stage 3. They were able to take the money that they were spending on schools and children and things like that, healthcare, and they were able to put it into industry and look at the economies and just the industrialization that's occurred in the Asian countries. It's quite amazing. And so that's what happens in phase 3 and then into phase 4 where you're fully industrialized. Now, one of the things that we're seeing now, though, is this sort of stage 5. It's not a real stage. But what's happened is the birth rate in many developed countries, right? Remember the numbers that I gave you. In Europe, it's less than 2, right? I mean, Japan is like 1.3, actually. Italy, I think, is like 1.6. So the United States, I said, was 1.8, 1.9. China is actually at 1.8, 1.9 now. So this is an interesting new thing that we've never seen before. We're in population decline in some countries. And the real problem with that is that you have a really high dependency ratio, which means you have a lot of old people that have to be supported by workers. But there's a labor shortage. There are not enough workers to support the elderly because you have a reduced tax revenue because there are fewer workers, and so you're not getting the income tax. And because the population is aging and you have a high number of elderly, you have higher healthcare costs, which are also being borne on the shoulders of those workers. And so this is a really interesting thing, and we don't really know what that's going to look like because we're in it right now. We're just in the beginning of it, so we're not really sure. But again, we'll talk about this more in another class. But this is an interesting thing, this sort of stage 5. Okay, so labor shortages and increased per capita healthcare costs are associated with, just for review, rapid population decline. Okay. When you have rapid population decline, you have labor shortages and increased per capita health care. Okay. Now, really slow population decline, that can happen, but you can kind of compensate for that. But when you have that total fertility rate that cuts down so low, that causes real problems. All right, so basically, when we talk about modern demographic transition, and we could have spent lots and lots of time talking in these notes about just the demographic transition itself. We're going to talk about it a lot. We're going to reference it a lot as we go through this unit. But basically, we're just talking about going from high birth rate, high death rate, to low birth rate, low death rate, and we do that through industrialization, okay? So there are some questions that we need to ask about modern demographic transition. When we look at this model, we're looking at the way that countries industrialized in the past. But now that there are many countries that are industrialized, we have to ask ourselves, do industrializing countries now have to go through the same steps to get there? Because one of those steps usually has to do with environmental degradation, right? So we want to ask ourselves, can that be changed? So there are really 3 big questions that we're asking about development today. And the first one is, can development be linked to reducing poverty? And the answer is yes. So some people are thinking, is it and should it be, right? Reduced to or linked to reducing poverty. The next question is not so clear-cut. Can development be sustainable? It's a really good question. Some people think that you can have only sustainable development. Some people think that development can never be sustainable. And then, of course, there's a spectrum in between. You just need to decide what you think. And it's one of the things we're talking about. Some development can be sustainable, right? The question is, can all development be sustainable? And then, can development be linked to elevating the status of individuals, human rights in general, but in particular, can it be linked to elevating the status of women, which is one of those things that is directly related to environmental sustainability and health? Ultimately, we need to recognize that both poverty and development are threats to the health of the environment. And so we have to figure out ways in which we can mitigate those threats. Okay, so we're going to shift just a little bit, and I want to talk about basic human needs. Everybody needs drinkable water, edible food, and safe housing. Everybody needs these things, okay? In a modern world, we also need healthcare, and we need an education. And in order to pay for all of these things, we need a job. And so when you look at basic human needs in the modern world, it's really these 6 things. And so one of the things that we do talk about when we talk about demographic transition is we talk about economic change, right? Because industrialization, development, in part, are about economic changes. And so this is really old data, and I haven't updated it, and I apologize. But the point is that we're dividing countries really into 3 groups. The high-income, highly developed, industrialized countries like the United States, Japan, and Canada. And our average income now is like $54,000, somewhere around there. Then we have our middle-income, moderately developed countries. These are going to be Latin America, South Africa, China, South India, right? The south of India is actually moderately developed. The Eastern Bloc countries, and I think they're up to like 12 or 16,000. I will give you the real data in class. And then low income and developing countries. These are our least developed countries. They are Sub-Saharan Africa, the northern India, Central Asia, and their average income is still less than $1,000 a year. So we're talking about some huge disparities between industrialized countries and developing nations. Industrialized countries are still about 20% of the world's population, and they still control about 75% of the world's wealth. So I will change these numbers for you, but it's about 20%, 25% of the world's population, and 75% of the world's wealth. Low-income developing countries are about 40, now about 50% of the population, and they control less than 10% of the world's gross national income. Ultimately, what you have is a difference in per capita income of over 60 to 1. There's a huge difference there. And so we run a big spectrum. But there are countries all along the path between these least developed countries that have TFRs of like 7. There are countries all along that, ranging from that all the way up to the most industrialized countries. But one thing is true. All countries around the world are becoming more affluent. That is part of being in stage 3 and 4, as we talked about. And so ultimately, when people become more affluent, they ultimately just want more, right? And so let's talk about that in terms of the basics. And this is all stuff we're going to talk about throughout the class. So this is just a quick overview of what people do to acquire food, right? Or to acquire shelter or any of these things. So this is just a quick overview. But when you're acquiring the basics in developing countries, it looks different than it does in industrialized countries, in developed countries. But still, we're wanting, with that rise in affluence, more consumption. We're seeing more consumption. So we're opening up new land that is probably not appropriate for farming. We're intensifying cultivation of existing land, and all of this destroys habitat. It destroys the soil resources. We end up poaching, right? So we can get more meat. Because one of the things we see with rising affluence is higher meat consumption, because people want faster protein sources and better protein sources. And so oftentimes we're looking at animal protein. And so there's a lot of poaching. Also, poaching is one of those things that gets money, right? And it's a big income thing. And you see a lot of bushmeat in least developed nations. Bushmeat is just what you go out and hunt, right? It can be anything. It's cheaper than beef, right? And cows are everywhere, so there's lots and lots of cows. But in some places, they're much more expensive. Like here, beef is relatively cheap compared to other places, but bushmeat is even cheaper than that. And it's a good source of protein for the rural and urban poor. And I mean good, not in terms of it's a good thing to pull animals out of the environment unsustainably, but it is a cheap, good source of protein. Rising poverty and homelessness, where you have wildlife-rich areas, really come into conflict a lot, right? And so if you have people who are living in poverty and they have a lot of wildlife, then bushmeat is going to be their go-to for protein. A lot of these places do not have good wildlife laws, and in reality, they really can't have good wildlife laws because it's hard to enforce those when you have a population that's starving. The other thing is that people just don't think about it. They don't actually know. And we're going to talk about some ways in which other countries, including South Africa, actually are raising awareness of wildlife, the importance of wildlife, and they're using women in really effective ways to combat poaching. All right, so what do you need? You need a job, right? You need money. So lots and lots of people are moving to cities. And when we move to cities, cities get bigger. And cities have environmental problems of their own. We'll talk about that when we talk about urbanization. They might move to other countries. If the cities around them don't have opportunities, then you're going to continue to look for those opportunities. And what we see are the birth of mega cities. We have cities that are tens of millions of people. They're huge, and they continue to grow. So what are some problems associated with populations migrating to cities in developing nations? Is there inadequate housing, sanitation, and services, too few jobs, increased crime, increased prostitution, all of the above? It's all of these things, right? One of the things that you see when people can't acquire money through a job, right, or a legitimate enterprise, is they will engage in illicit activities for income. That can be poaching, and what you're looking here are elephant tusks, rhino horns, and then pelts of endangered species. That can also just be over-harvesting. These are all shells, they're all caught wild, and so that puts a huge burden on the oceanic community, right? So just harvesting stuff, decorative plants, all of that. And we'll talk about this more later. There's also drugs and smuggling, guns, things like that. Human trafficking, we'll talk about all of these things later on too. And it's not just that, right? It's also, it's also prostitution, right? And so you'll notice that I've sort of separated out crime and prostitution. Prostitution is illegal and it is a crime. Having said that, most women don't say, I want to grow up and be in prostitution. And so when you have women in prostitution, it is generally because they don't have any other choices. And so I like to separate it out. Oftentimes those women are trafficked. And so I separate this out because you have a kind of different situation. All right, so and those are just some of the things. We'll talk about more of these things later on. So it's like a preview. So I put this in here so you could see kind of a flow chart. There's all kinds of consequences of these exploding populations in the developing world, most of which are living in cities. Yeah. All right, so ultimately we can break down the human pressure on the environment into these 4 factors: poverty, population size, affluence, and technology. These are the big pressures that are going to cause all of the environmental issues that we talk about. Affluence and technology are related to late stage 3 and stage 4. So affluence in the United States, we consume lots of things, right? We consume the largest share of the majorly traded commodities. We eat more than 3 times the global average of meat, although that number's going down. Lots of more people around the world are eating meat, and so this number's not entirely accurate anymore. I will get you the new number. We also, interestingly enough, lead the world in paper consumption. Even though we're all technologically advanced, we still use so much paper. Again, these are all things we'll talk about more later on. In general, advances in technology increase energy consumption, increase raw material harvest and pollution, influence environmental impact, may be more efficient or less efficient than the technologies they replace, or can be described by all of the above. They're all of these things, right? We use more energy, we use more stuff, we, take a higher toll on the environment, and technology doesn't necessarily mean more efficient. It doesn't mean more environmentally friendly. It just means that, you're doing something. All right, environmental trends ultimately. In non-industrial societies, we're really focusing on food production as the big environmental area, right? This is the big environmental hotspot. In industrialized societies, it's also about food production, but this is where we're seeing our mechanized agriculture, and then we're seeing air pollution and water pollution. I don't actually have water pollution on the list. I'm not sure why. I guess I forgot to put it there, but pollution in general, right? So mechanized agriculture and pollution for industrialized societies. Ultimately, every region has an ecological footprint, and this is how much you are using, right, in the environment. And you're going to be calculating your ecological footprint, so you will know, if everybody lived like you, how many Earths would we need to support the population. And it's a very interesting exercise. Obviously, high-income countries have really large footprints. We use a lot of electricity, we use a lot of water, we consume a lot of stuff. Low-income countries, even though poverty has a huge impact on the environment, they are using less resources typically because they simply can't afford the consumption. So consumption is a big deal. So your last question is this: environmental stewardship can be increased by all of the following except wildlife conservation, pollution control, energy conservation and efficiency, maintaining rates of consumption, or recycling. This one should be obvious. High rates of consumption are detrimental to the environment, right? I mean, it's just, that is data driven. When you use lots of resources, that has an environmental cost. And so this is one of the areas where we can talk about improvement, right? All right. Again, this was kind of just a smattering of things. The point of this conversation was really to talk about what's happening in particular in phase 3 and 4 of demographic transition. We talked about phase 2 in the last notes, even though you didn't realize it at the time, you do now. So make sure you understand each of those phases and how birth and death rates are changing and what the impact of that is. So if you have questions, please ask them in the beginning of class. And thanks for listening. I will see you next time.